The Across the Aisle podcast is brought to you by the University of Canberra to provide informed bipartisan commentary on the 2025 Australian federal election across the aisle. It brings insights and observations from two political veterans from different sides of Australian politics, as well as from their invited guests. David Feeney and University of Canberra adjunct Professor Scott Ryan both got involved in politics at university for the Labor Party and Liberal Party respectively. Scott went on to work for the Institute for Public Affairs and pharmaceutical company GlaxoSmithKline and was elected to the Australian Senate in 2007. He held various positions in the Abbott and Turnbull ministries and was president of the Senate for 4 years until in 2021 he was appointed Australia's High Commissioner to Canada. In 2024, Scott and his family returned to Australia and settled in Canberra. David Feeney has held multiple positions in the ALP, including as a campaign director, and was elected to the Australian Senate in 2007. He served as Parliamentary Secretary for Defence in the Gillard and Second Rudd ministries. In 2013, David moved to the House of Representatives, winning the Victorian seat of Batman. He left politics in 2018 when found to be a dual citizen by the High Court. Since then, David has worked in the defence and strategic policy sector based in Melbourne, where he lives with his family. Now let's join David and Scott's conversation across the aisle.
Well, welcome back to episode 2 of Across the Aisle with David Feeney and myself, Scott Ryan. This week we find David in Western Australia and I am in Canberra as we enter the third week of the campaign, having had some major announcements, turnarounds and the campaign launches over the weekend. How's Western Australia, David?
Well, it's lovely. A great Labor state, of course. And as you say, the election is now in full gear. The rubber has hit the road. We've had the first of the debates on Sky, the so-called People's Forum, as well as a number of senior shadow ministers debating each other, the treasurers and energy ministers. So plenty to talk about.
Yes, WA did have that state election recently, which kept it a very Labor state, and from my perspective, probably too much of a Labor state, but I take your point there. I suppose, David, over the first couple of weeks, we've sort of seen a relentless Labor focus on what they went into their budget week with just before the campaign started and subsequently, which is a real focus with pictures and words on Medicare and the Prime Minister holding up his Medicare card with the number, specially taped over so no one can read it.
Yeah, I think as we finished on last week, I think Labor launched itself into this campaign in a very, very clever and effective way where it came straight out of Parliament on the back of a budget where it had implemented tax cuts, and we touched very briefly on the fact that I think Peter Dutton misstepped when he made the decision to oppose those tax cuts in the Parliament because he gifted Labor the line, how can you trust Peter Dutton on your cost of living when he doesn't even support a tax cut? And so I feel like that was an important misstep by the coalition, and it overshadowed Peter Dutton's own address in reply on the Thursday night, and it really meant that Labor came into the campaign out of the starter's gate, I think, with some real momentum and a sense of mission. And that discipline, that message discipline, that image discipline, I think, has held throughout the effort so far. And so the Labor campaign has really been focused on, cost of living and cost of living adjacent issues like Medicare. But I think other issues have played into Labor's hands as well. We talked last week about the fact that in government, the Labor Party had been constantly driven off message by external events of consequence. Well, it seems like for the very first time, an external event hit the election campaign, which actually worked to the benefit of the Labor Party rather than against it, as all the others have. And that, of course, is Donald Trump and Liberation Day. And suddenly the Labor Party was presented with Donald Trump offending the world as well as Australians, and it was an external event that played well for a Prime Minister that stood up and said this is not the act of a friend. And so I feel like Donald Trump's intervention worked for the government, and I feel like again Dutton mishandled this by asserting that he would have been able to talk to Trump and he would have got a meeting and he would have got a better deal. I think that was really just errant nonsense to any observer watching the antics of Donald Trump. It wasn't plausible. And then when Dutton talked about leveraging a relationship with the Americans to get a better result by putting the defence relationship on the table, we saw John Howard enter the debate and say that would be a misstep. We saw Labor say, well, that sort of horizontal escalation of the relationship would be a misstep. And suddenly Dutton was all at sea on national security and foreign affairs matters. So for the very first time in a very long time, the external events and how they played out in domestic politics worked for Labor after having so many occasions seen it work against Labor.
Well, to turn to Donald Trump, I think you're right. He makes the opposition's job a lot harder. And I think there's one big reason for that and a couple of others. I think the big reason is that the threshold for change rises as the world gets more unstable. And it wasn't just Liberation Day with Donald Trump. It was then the day after where some got exempted and U-turned. And then on the weekend, we found the iPhone got exempt. And it's the constant flagging of going forward of what some of his supporters call the art of the deal, the rest of us call profound instability, unpredictability, and sometimes chaos. And I think that makes it harder for an opposition more generally, because then people say, well, the world's changing. I've got to be more convinced about some change that I might choose. Mm. And I think that compounds what happens at the start of every election campaign. You know, polls between elections are reflections on how people think the government's doing, I think, and how they wish it would do. At the start of a campaign, it's a constrained choice. You know, I'm choosing between option A and option B, and there's naturally a focus that turns to the opposition at the start of a campaign that isn't there, I think, apart from occasional moments like a budget reply, but that was essentially part of the campaign this time. That essentially isn't there through most of the term of government. And if I go back through time, even recent campaigns, it's fair to say, I'd say the first fortnight for the coalition didn't go as well as hoped. But then going back to 2022, Anthony Albanese had a horrid start to the campaign. You know, he didn't remember the unemployment rate, I think it was, and then he caught COVID. I do think oppositions suddenly get a lot of pressure at the start of a campaign, and the adjusting to that can sometimes take some time. I disagree with you on the way you characterised Peter Dutton's response to the Trump issue, particularly the initial imposition upon Australia before Liberation Day. It does seem like we're living politics in dog weeks, so to speak. It does seem like a long time ago, the first Donald Trump announcement on tariffs. I don't think he put the security relationship on the table as much as outlined that's an equity we have. I remember in the 80s when, even under the Reagan and Bush administration, farmers would protest against subsidised wheat sales to Australian markets. And it's been pretty much a unified element of both parties of government in Australia that we don't leverage that. And I think what Peter was doing, and when I looked at the words, I thought this was the case as well, was reflecting that we have equities rather than using it as a tool to negotiate. But I do think that it's fair to say that whatever happens with the third leader in this campaign over the next 3 weeks probably makes the opposition's life much, much more difficult. But I just wanted to go back to Medicare, David, because you've run state campaigns in a couple of states and federal campaigns. So to sort of give us an insight into Labor's focus on Medicare, because it's not just now, it's also historic. You know, those of us who are in the 2016 election still have conniptions about what we call Medicare, a campaign that was focused on a message that a lot of the community never saw, didn't go through the mainstream media, and for the first time ever sort of bypassed it and had a real impact on voters. That's probably the first campaign tool I saw that completely bypassed mainstream media yet had an impact. But even back in 1993 and 1987 with the famous, I think it was called the Whinging Wendy ad, we wouldn't call it that these days, Medicare has been something Labor's focused on and always tried to portray the coalition as not supportive. So I was just wondering, how does that work in the modern media era as a campaign director?
Well, it's kind of got some eternal characteristics, but then it's got other parts that are context-driven. The eternal characteristics perhaps are the sort of introduction of universal healthcare into Australia was ultimately achieved by the Whitlam government. Well, first introduced by the Whitlam government and then consolidated by the Hawke government, opposed throughout that period from the 70s into the early 80s by the Liberal Party. And so I guess there's a belief that, you know, sort of intrinsic into the branding of both major political parties is a sense that Labor invented it and supports it and the Liberal Party is against it and doesn't like it. And while the Liberal Party has endeavoured in more recent times to say that this is now a bipartisan institution supported by both sides, there is, I think, that sort of eternal branding around both parties. And then the context-driven, there are moments in time when concern about Medicare comes to the fore. And I think one of those moments right now is it's an institution that helps underpin families and their health and their ability to afford healthcare. And they are watching, again, the Donald and his threats to the pharmaceutical benefit scheme. And I feel like that can be conflated with a long-standing belief that the Liberal Party is a threat to Medicare and that only Labor ultimately is truly going to defend it. The Liberals will seek to undermine it, circumvent it, and push private health insurance. So I feel like it's sort of low-hanging fruit for Labor, isn't it? It's a popular institution and one upon which families rely, and one where Labor is seen to be its best and sometimes its only defender.
Well, as you know, both sides of politics generally have equities, what we call, sort of where the public instinctively trusts them a little bit more than the other side.
Yeah.
And I do see Medicare, because I remember post-1993, Andrew Robb telling us that Medicare was as big an issue for many people as the GST in that fight-back election. And obviously the Labor Party's Mediscare, the targeted text message campaign that a lot of people didn't see in 2016, had an impact in making that election closer than it was expected to be. I see it in some ways as a bit like what I'd call the broader protection issue, where essentially, as John Howard famously said, he'll be the best friend Medicare ever had, and the coalition had to come to the party because it was a publicly popular, widely supported scheme. But it took a while for the Liberal Party to get there. In some ways, border protection has been similar, I think, for Labor, where people instinctively trusted the coalition, and if there's ever any loss of control over, unlawful migration or uncontrolled migration, then that poses a very big risk to the Labor Party because there's the instinctive trust of the coalition. And obviously Labor try and make Medicare a bigger issue. But going on through the campaign, we had over the course of the subsequent couple of weeks, we had the coalition's announcement and then U-turn on work from home arrangements, which, while the policy focused on the public service, became a much wider issue across the campaign. Personally, while we've got the international economic order being turned upside down, I found it fascinating that the Australian election was focusing on that issue, but the voters get to choose what the issues are. But what I thought was interesting about that was the opposition came out and has said, well, we're essentially going to withdraw the policy because it's been misrepresented or misinterpreted. They said the Labor Party had run a scare campaign. Yes. Whereas I think it was interesting that thinking about how that works inside a campaign, you've been there, David, what would be happening is that candidates and members of parliament would be calling the campaign headquarters saying, you may be saying it's for public servants in Canberra, but that's not the way it's being interpreted in the outer suburbs of Melbourne or Sydney. You may be saying it only works for the public sector, but some people in particular were saying, and some of the data showed that female voters and women were particularly hostile to it because there are changed work practices that have been adopted since the COVID pandemic, particularly in places like Melbourne and Sydney.
Yeah, I thought this was a particularly bad moment for the coalition. I'd sort of almost go so far as to say buffoonery. And let me explain my use of such extreme language. Firstly, I thought it was a big step for the coalition to have Dutton withdraw a policy like this. And the fact that in withdrawing the policy, he and his shadow ministers accompanied that with an apology, apologising for the policy, I thought was a remarkable bit of framing. Because Dutton's sort of great strength as a candidate is the perception, the broadly held perception that he's strong. Now, being strong, of course, it can be a two-sided coin, and Labor's campaign is trying to emphasise one side of that coin, isn't it? When it talks about his strength, meaning that he's going to, cut, and that his strengths mean that he's the kind of figure who's, going to be harsh. But there's another aspect to that strength characteristic, which of course is, that he's a man of principle who's going to do what needs to be done in the national interest. And I think by having him retreat and apologise, they undermined that critical element of what is his strength. And then on the policy itself, the fact that they did this in the middle of school holidays when parents are juggling their children, and as you say, around a policy that had clearly gone south on them, it raises the question of timing. And it speaks to the fact that the coalition has been developing and promoting policy apparently not in conjunction with or coordinated with their organisational wing. So why is it that candidates and researchers and campaigners are only able to identify this policy misstep now? And I think in terms of execution, in terms of substance, and in terms of what it says about the Liberal campaign, all of that very bad.
Well, I disagree on a couple of things there. Firstly, I think it's partly public attention. I mean, as I said earlier, the public turns its mind to what the opposition's saying really when we say, well, in 5 weeks or 3 weeks, you've got to vote. And so I do think you get a degree of public attention there. Sometimes you can make policy announcements that are heard differently than the way you intend. And I think this is one of them. If you look at the Liberal Party as I know it, you have a lot of people in it for whom work from home is not an option. They're small business people, they're on the road, that sort of thing. So it can be just a reflection of the fact that where the members are or where the active members are. But when it comes to Peter Dutton's turnaround, I mean, you've got two alternatives, which is to keep doing it or to say you got it wrong. And one of the things we often hear from people when they're talking about politicians is you won't admit when you got it wrong or you won't admit when you can't do it. I don't think it hurts with the public as opposed to the media and the commentators for a politician to say, look, I got it wrong and I'm sorry. I mean, I don't even want to try and count the number of times Peter Beattie did that. It didn't seem to hurt him in Queensland. And Steve Braxton, that wasn't shy of that either. I think ideally the coalition would prefer that 2 weeks didn't happen, but when you're constrained by, all right, I need to fix a problem, it's best to come out and own it. So I reckon when people start to come and vote, it does seem like a long time ago, and that's partly going to the Trump effect of this campaign. This campaign has only been going 2 weeks, really, 2.5 weeks, and it does feel like it's gone longer because of what's happening around the world and what's happening even domestically, as most parties have really probably announced a bit more policy in the first 2.5 weeks this time than they did in 2022.
Yeah, that's true. But I just feel like from those early moments of the campaign and then underlined by that policy retreat by the coalition has given the Labor Party a very strong start to this election campaign.
I think it's fair to say that, and the polls reflect it, that the Labor Party has pulled back a few points. I mean, today's news poll, as we record this, essentially shows the result is exactly where it is at the last election, well within the rounding error at the polls and decimal places. And the negatives for Prime Minister Albanese have dropped from sort of -14 to -5, and with Peter Dutton they've gone, I think, from about -14 to -19. And compared to the last election in particular, I think Anthony Albanese has had a good start to the campaign. And you could sort of see that at the campaign launch and campaign launches that occurred yesterday in Sydney and in Perth, where I saw some commentators and watching it myself. I don't think there were a huge number of viewers during school holidays all around the country on a lovely Sunday afternoon up the East Coast, but I was. You saw the Labor Party, I think, at ease and confident. I don't think there was a lack of it on the other side, but there was a confidence and an ease that seemed to show that the Labor Party thought the campaign was where they wanted it to be.
The Labor Party campaign launch looked very familiar to me, as you can imagine. It was showcasing the leaders, showcasing the prominent personalities past and present of the party, and in front of a big rapturous crowd. It was very traditional and very effective. And there was one thing about the Liberal Party launch that I thought was perhaps a bit discordant, and I'll be interested in your thoughts about this. But one of the criticisms of the coalition campaign, so far anyway, has been that it's low energy. With the onus being on the coalition to mix things up and bring about change, they need to be sort of more aggressive, more high energy, and they don't seem to have hit that note. And the launch seemed to sort of continue this low energy approach. So it was small. It was only about 250 people. I felt like it wasn't the big sort of razzmatazz campaign launch that perhaps we would normally expect.
Look, and I did see that. The Labor one was definitely glitzier, and It was done in the round. It looked more show busy, to be honest.
Yes, yeah, it did.
I think the last campaign launch I went to for the Liberal Party that I thought was significant and large was either 2001 or 2007. I remember being at the recital hall in Sydney for John Howard in 2001, where he famously said, we will decide who comes to this country and the circumstances in which they come. And that was large. But since then, I've noticed ours have been a bit smaller, and I'm not sure if that is partly a reflection that, look, the campaign launches are really just aren't they cheap content for news networks? I mean, no one is actually watching them. I'm serious when I say I don't think many Australians were using Sunday of school holidays and the last, nice weather of the autumn, sitting at home watching that on a Sunday morning and a Sunday afternoon.
No.
I think the coverage of it matters, and there were coverage of it, and there were packages of it on the news, but that was 2 or 3 minutes. And that basically went to the content of the launch, the announcement that both parties made, more significant, I think, than previous campaign launches, rather than the glitz or the glamour or the production values. But I've noticed over a while that the Labor campaign launches do tend to be a bit glitzier. Ours do tend to be a bit more constrained. I'm not sure why that is. I think the only person I've heard use the phrase low energy before is Donald Trump. So I wouldn't use that phrase. But yeah, there was a different vibe between it. But that goes back. I remember that in 2016. I remember that in 2019.
Yeah, well, it struck me as a thing. I mean, as you say, campaign launches are not carefully studied by many viewers. And they've been increasingly getting later and later in the campaigns, haven't they? As both sides sort of try and use it as a mid-election boost or a boost on the eve of the campaigns confronting the challenge of early voting and trying to get some last messages in front of voters before so many of them vote ahead of polling day. But nonetheless, I just thought it struck me, perhaps more so than it has struck me previously, that the Liberal launch was quite a low-key, yes, I'll say it, low-energy event.
No, I think that's right. It did strike me as lower key, and it very much focused on the speech of the leader, whereas I thought the Labor one, you had more stars, so to speak, obviously Roger Cook being one of them, it being in Perth with his recent election victory.
Yeah.
But it did strike me, as you mentioned, they were a bit earlier than they have been on average in the last, few elections. I remember one campaign launch was the Sunday before polling day, and there'd already been.
Well, yes, that makes me suspicious, Scott, that we're going to get some more campaign launches before we're finished.
But they did make some substantive announcements.
Yeah, they did.
And I think this is worth reflecting on. You had the Coalition make the announcement with respect to tax deductibility for some new build first home buyers for mortgage interest, and the reinstitution of the low and middle income earners tax offset that existed for a couple of years under Scott Morrison. And under Labor, again, with a focus on housing, you had the announcement with respect to the $10 billion, partly loans, partly spending to support commercial building of houses for first home buyers, and then the instant $1,000 tax deductibility claim in lieu of doing a tax return, which tells me that both sides are now converging on the same ground. I mean, you had Labor talking about Medicare, which you described as a sort of cost of living adjacent issue, but now both parties are converging on housing and taxation. 3 weeks out from polling day, albeit only a week before some people start to vote.
Yes, and I thought the Liberal policy also included people being able to access their superannuation,
course, yeah.
I think to a maximum of $50,000 to support a deposit. Yeah, I thought those, as you say, both tending towards housing, and I think a little bit of controversy around both formula really. And I noticed a lot of pundits came out and said, well, gee, that was an expensive Sunday, because both sides just made some big expensive promises and neither side offered much of an explanation about how they were going to be paid for or offset. But yes, both sides clearly came to their respective parties yesterday wanting to launch some policies that they believe would be popular and would attract the attention of the Australian people.
And it sort of reflects the changing demographics of the electorate. I did read earlier and looked at the enrolment statistics. I think this is the first time we're going to have more people, Gen Z and younger, older than baby boomers. Our generation, Gen X, David, don't know where we went. We're out there somewhere. But that reflects younger people in particular and the housing market and the challenges we face there. The criticism that newspapers have made this morning is there needs to be more done on the supply side, whereas the Coalition is also committing to reducing immigration to reduce demand pressure in that space. But it does seem to be converging on those two key policy issues. which I think will lead to an interesting next 3 weeks, because absent any other announcements, it's really a campaign infrastructure challenge now. Who can get the message to as many voters in the way that they want the messages targeted and received by those voters, rather than defined by their opposition? Because we don't have the same ability to do that and rely on the mainstream media to do that. And so whether that be through targeted digital media, targeted SMSs, in the old days it was direct mail, but there's only a couple of deliveries a week. That's really not for younger people either. How the campaign infrastructure gets this out to key voters, with voting starting in 7 or 8 days.
And where are the minor parties and the independents? I feel like their share of the political story has been in decline over the last couple of weeks, but I'm sure it will roar back. But, Teals and Greens, but particularly Teals, flourish when there's sunlight, when there's lots of media, when there are journalists talking about them. I feel like they've spent a couple of weeks in the shade.
Well, that's interesting, because this morning's poll essentially has them getting the same share of the vote as they did at the last election, give or take the rounding error, along with other minor parties. And when you traditionally have close elections, you often had a squeezing of the third party vote, but that doesn't seem to be happening this time. And it is harder when you look at, mainstream media. I've got friends that live in some of the Teal seats, and they're being completely bombarded in their social media and locally, but you don't see it if you live on the other side of the road. And because they're local candidates, they get, I'd say, a fairly well-proportioned coverage in the mainstream media, given they only hold one seat in their own case out of the House of Representatives. I think there's a lot going on under the surface that we don't see and that other voters don't see. But it is interesting, you say, because if the polls are now saying they predict effectively a hung parliament, then presumably over the coming weeks there is going to be more pressure put on the crossbench to say, well, if you're not going to say who you're going to support in office, what are the criteria you're going to do? And I noticed that David Spears was trying to do that with Monique Ryan yesterday, but the Teals seem to be even laying out criteria for what they might use to frame such a decision.
Oh, and Adam Bant's been very, very aggressive about it. He's been preparing his ransom note in front of the media for quite some weeks.
Well, I don't think he's troubling the score on my former colleagues, David.
I think he said there's no way he'll support a Dutton government, and he looks forward to serving Anthony Albanese a long list of demands. And that, of course, always creates the inevitable banter where Conservatives try and say, oh, this is going to be the Green Labor government, full of crackpot ideas inflicted on us by the Greens. And so then the dance is danced where Labor says, we're not going to do a deal with the Greens. But I think on this occasion, when Anthony Albanese says he's not going to do a deal with the Greens, he really, really means it.
Well, hasn't Adam Bant basically said you don't have to? I mean, from a negotiating point of view, he's obviously, he wants to say to his voters, I'll never support Peter Dutton. But at the same time, if he said that, then can't Anthony Albanese or Labor Party take Adam Bant for granted if his vote is needed?
Yes, but that would require, now we're delving wildly into the land of hypotheticals, but let's go there. Let's go to hypothetical land. If you were in a situation where the Greens could make or break a vote of confidence on the floor of the House of Representatives, and Labor march into that contest without an agreement with the Greens, they would be presenting the Greens with the conundrum of, do they bring down the government and wear it, or do they blink and support the Labor government? And I think for the Greens, there's only one way to handle that situation, because if they brought down the Labor government, it would be their own destruction. But for Labor ministers to march into the House with the requisite amount of courage to put it all onto a vote like that, not easy.
Well, maybe if it turns out after polling day, this could be worthy of a longer discussion as these negotiations go on.
Absolutely.
But with the announcements yesterday, David, one thing that struck me is something we alluded to last week, which is the change in public attitudes towards debt and deficit. So the commentators are saying, well, where are the offsets? You mentioned that earlier yourself. It's a question I ask myself. But have we moved into an election era where, whether it's because of housing stress and economic stress at the household level or cost of living or uncertainty, I wonder now whether or not that old argument about where's the money coming from simply doesn't bite the way it used to. Because you're quite right, both parties have made significant promises. The coalition will always attack the Labor Party on that grounds of budget management, in this case say that they're due to windfall gains and all that. And Jim Chalmers has his response, as we saw in the debate with Angus Taylor last week. But if it's come to the point where the money doesn't come from doesn't matter anymore, these may not be the last of the announcements to come.
Yeah, you must be right. I mean, it must just not be the issue that imposes itself on the political debate like it once did. I remember in 2007 when Kevin Rudd made the decision, very astute, I think, reading of Mood, when he said, this reckless spending must stop. And he wasn't going to match a Howard commitment. And that caught a mood, didn't it? Not just amongst opinion elites, and of course it did that, but it caught a mood in the electorate, hey, this auction is going a little crazy. Those instincts, are they still there? If one of the two candidates got up now and said this reckless spending must stop, I guess the first thing we might say is it's too late, but would that catch your mood, or would it just be trampled over by the rush of people going towards, the bigger promise?
Well, that's a long time ago, so someone who was 6 months old when Kevin Rudd said that is voting at this election. So I think it's important. We've been through it's been a pretty significant decade, and I am reminded by some of the research, and I think it's Cos Samaras from Redbridge who said this on the ABC last week, that people have different expectations of government, partly because they saw what government did during COVID. And that was everything he was alluding to, I believe, from job seeker to, health measures and all that, whether that be additional health supports. Of course, people did see that, but I think maybe what we haven't cottoned on to is it came at quite an extraordinary cost, hundreds of billions of dollars across the state and Commonwealth level. And I think if Cos is correct on that, then we have actually changed that frame a little, which could change politics going forward. But with the world going the way it is, it could come to an abrupt end very soon if we have a hit to our terms of trade or a hit to our, exports because of what Donald Trump's doing to the global trading environment. So it'd be interesting to see what happens over the coming year with respect to that.
Yes, the worm can turn, can't it? I mean, perhaps as Victorians who came up through, for my own part, the Kane Kearney years kind of scarred a generation of Labor veterans about the importance of managing the economy and being seen to manage the economy. Those, for both sides of politics, those lessons perhaps have to be learned and relearned.
Yeah, and that framed my experience too, coming up on the other side in a similar era. The difficult choices that the then Kennett government, then the Howard government was making to try and address that. They weren't easy. But as we head now into the Easter break, David, where I think we've just started school holidays in New South Wales and Queensland, I think we started them in Victoria, Tasmania last week. So we're heading into that 2 to 3 week period where a lot of people are on holidays. Voting starts on Easter Tuesday, which I believe will be the 22nd of April, after the Easter long weekend. And just looking at some key statistics from last week, the Australian Electoral Commission reached a record enrolment level. Over 98% of eligible Australians are now enrolled to vote, which is truly extraordinary for a country like Australia. It's always been in the 90s, but with the automatic or direct enrolment, as the AEC calls it now, when you graduate from high school or when you get your driver's licence, that has become much more accurate. Some people do say turnout is declining. That's actually not true. What's happening is the AEC is now enrolling people who sometimes don't know it, who then don't vote. So in fact, you're still getting increasing numbers of voters. It's just that the percentage is slightly declining because the base figure has increased to over 98%. But interestingly now, there are 870,000 more voters enrolled than at the 2022 election, which is the equivalent of sort of 7 or 8 electorates in the House of Representatives alone. It shows you the scale of both population growth we've had, but also the change in the electoral roll, because they are overwhelmingly young people.
And as we touched on last week, the feature of compulsory voting, I'm reminded of the fact that in the recent US presidential elections, about a third of Americans did not vote. And it's easy now with hindsight to say that those are the 1/3 that made such a profound contribution because they had nothing to do with who actually won. That third, of course, is driven to the polls in this country, and that has dramatic impacts in terms of the campaigns not having to turn out the vote endeavours, but also in the kind of person the low engagement voter who's turning up and obliged to make a decision about their democracy.
And I'd say I reflect upon this. I learnt this while living overseas, the importance of that to generating what I'll call, if not enthusiasm for elections, then acquiescence in the legitimacy of their results. And particularly preferential voting too. No one's vote is wasted in the sense that, your number 2 or your number 3 will usually count if you don't succeed in your candidate being the majority candidate. So the combination of those factors means that in sort of academic parlance, Australian politics tends to gravitate towards the median voter in the centre a bit more than those electorates where they are required to mobilise. I think that's changing with social media. It's just that we have a few more protections there. But I think one of the biggest changes I've noticed, David, since we probably started is with this increase in enrolment, with the pre-poll period now going for 2 weeks and being much more liberal. You used to have to fill out a form and state the reason you couldn't vote on polling day. Mm. The AEC was expecting more than half of the people to not vote on polling day, which means that you're going to have a whole bunch of people voting after 3 weeks of the campaign, not 5.
Yes, and it's torture, isn't it, for the campaigns? I just remember the long hours. I mean, once upon a time we had to staff, 30 or 40 polling places in an urban electorate on one day, but suddenly you find yourself with 1 or 2 or 3 polling places that are open for long hours every day for weeks. Yep. And staffing that is torture. And then as the candidate, there was a view that the candidate needed to be there because, hey, where else? We're better for the candidate to be than somewhere where people are voting and can see them. And so candidates are spending incredible amounts of time at these polling places, and it's exhausting for campaigns. Now, I think it's a virtue and it should happen and it's good, but it has changed campaigns, what they do and how they time what they do. And as we discussed a moment ago, the fact that campaign launches are now often timed to coincide with giving campaigns a boost on the eve of early voting, it's had a big impact.
Yeah, I think it'll be very interesting to see, particularly because it'll be during school holidays, and particularly because the lead up to this campaign was quite long. Everyone knew it was going to be give or take April or May for quite a long time. How many people come out? Because at every single election we are seeing an increase in the number of people vote early. And I don't know if it's going to be the same this time, but Saturday afternoon on a polling booth, you used to get that last minute rush. It's now tumbleweeds.
Yes, that's true.
Yeah, and it feels like it goes on a lot longer too.
Yes.
So look, with that starting next week, I think we'll do our next podcast then. In coming weeks, we'll do a bit of a race around the states to look at some key constituencies, as well as developments over the week before pre-poll commences. And I think next week, David will be coming to everyone a day or so later because of the Easter long weekend.
Very good. Well, I guess as long as this election stays interesting, we'll have plenty to talk about.
Thanks all.
David and Scott are following the campaign over coming weeks and will return weekly with further informed analysis and opinion right up to Election Day on the 3rd of May. So save this podcast to your favourites and be sure to join Across the Aisle again next week, brought to you by the University of Canberra with production by the Faculty of Arts and Design.